Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on your location. And I'd like to thank you for joining us today for the Big Data Thought Leadership webinar entitled Healthcare Business Intelligence, a Guide to Empowering Successful Data Reporting and Analytics. A couple housekeeping items today. Please feel free to submit your questions via the chat tool. You can send your open questions to all participants, or you can send your questions privately to the moderator and speaker from the drop-down menu. So today I'd like to introduce Laura Madison, our Big Data Thought Leader and Healthcare Expert today. Hello, Laura.
Hello.
And I am David Morris of Cetas by VMware, and I'll be moderating for our webinar today. So Laura Madison has extensive experience in healthcare business intelligence and big data analytics. Ms. Madison is an active member of the healthcare community and is the founder of the Business Intelligence Summit. She's spoken internationally as a healthcare business intelligence expert, and currently Ms. Madison leads the healthcare practice for Lancet, a leading business intelligence consulting firm. Ms. Madison has initiated and supported dozens of business intelligence initiatives and has worked on over 50 health plans. As an author, her most recent work is the topic of today's webinar, Healthcare Business Intelligence, a Guide to Empowering Successful Data Reporting and Analytics. Again, Laura, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, happy to be here.
So, in reading your book, you've really covered everything from defining the problem to providing a working business intelligence taxonomy to offering, really practical advice and best practices and case studies as well. I mean, it's really basically a blueprint for planning, deploying, and managing a business intelligence and big data project, isn't it?
That certainly was the intent, David. I really wanted to give a relatively broad view of what it took to do this work.
Okay, and as I was reading the book there, it became really apparent to me that improving the healthcare system is really more than a job for you. It's really a passion in the context of, I guess, the next two questions I'd like to ask. It was a really impactful story to me as I was reading your book. Can you share with us how the healthcare system failed you personally and how you went about identifying the breakdown in the healthcare system?
Sure. Well, a number of years ago, I had been experiencing some difficulties from a health perspective, and I grew up in a really small town, and we'd go to the doctor, and then we'd go to the doctor, and then we'd go to the doctor, and this went on for years, probably 3 years. And we were referred to other doctors and that kind of a thing. And after 3 years of begging for relief, my medical record, which at that point was paper, was as big as a dictionary, and it was a real challenge from my perspective. I didn't really understand, of course, what was happening or why it was happening. And then as I went through finding the physician that ended up treating me and being diagnosed with something that thankfully is chronic but not life-threatening, I recognized that the real challenge wasn't with the care team and their ability to, provide what they needed to provide, in this context care. It really had a lot to do with the disintegration of the information and the sharing of that information. We go back and forth all the time with, they'd ask me my name, my date of birth, my symptoms, all of that stuff I'd covered 100 times before that. And it was, if nothing else, it was very frustrating. But on the other side of that, I thought, well, what if I had something that was life-threatening and was very time-sensitive? And the idea that it would take that long or that basic information needed to be repeated was very disconcerting to me. So that prompted my personal, goal, starting at a very young age, to try to see if there was a better way to do things.
And so this, I think this text is, a labor of love in some ways. So would you like to cover it with us?
Sure, I'd be happy to. It really was a labor of love. Lots of labor, maybe a little bit of love. No, it definitely was. It definitely was. So today we're going to cover about 4 bullet points. We may get into a couple of side topics as related to these items. But these were the things that I covered for the most part in the book. Obviously, we're going to cover them at a relatively high level for our time together here. But we'll talk a little bit about business intelligence and big data in healthcare. Certainly a very popular topic right now. We're going to talk about streamlining for regulatory reporting, and that's every industry is a little bit different, and healthcare, I think, is very different. But some of the biggest challenges we have are really around regulatory reporting. There are so many regulatory needs. And so how do we, improve that process so that we're not so tied up in the regulatory that we miss an opportunity from a data perspective or a business perspective to be able to get really valuable information out of those systems to help us do a better job, not just checkbox activity from a regulatory reporting perspective. Everybody likes the 10 things not to do. So we'll talk a little bit about how to sidestep the 10 most common mistakes that I see for healthcare business intelligence, and then we're going to talk about a couple of trends that I see happening very quickly from a healthcare business intelligence perspective. So the first one is this idea of big data, or the impact of big data on healthcare analytics. And I tell you, I can't remember the first time I saw the term big data, but between whenever that was and now, I'm thinking that it has increased as fast as the concept of big data has. It is really incredible. The buzz is nearly deafening. What I think is very important from a healthcare perspective is for us to get above all of that activity, a lot of it marketing and sales activity, to understand how big data can impact us directly in healthcare. I was doing a little bit of research for this webinar, and I actually ran across, there's actually a coffee table book that you can buy now on the topic of big data. This big book that you can put on your coffee table and sit around and have a conversation about big data and how it impacts our lives. And I would love to admit that I wouldn't buy it, but of course I would, because that's what I do. But it really has reached mass capacity as far as the buzz around big data. So, a lot of folks define big data as volume, velocity, and variety. So there's a lot of it. It happens fast, and it varies in its intensity and the type and all of that. I think they're missing one V that's probably more important than the other 3, and that's the V for value. And this is what I continue to want to drive home, not just necessarily from a healthcare BI perspective, although that's where I focus, but from a BI perspective overall, from a healthcare perspective. There's really no value in just having lots and lots and lots and lots of data unless you really know what to do with it. So we really need to focus on that idea of value. Last year, most of you probably saw this come across in some article or referenced in some article, but the McKinsey Global Institute completed an analysis. I think this was done about a year ago now. And they found that there was $300 billion of potential annual value to the U.S. healthcare system in data, specifically in big data. And the interesting thing about this is that they found that value not in the process improvements of the value of using the data, but actually making modifications to the care that we provide. So in other words, we're not talking about small incremental efficiencies to processes. We're talking about looking at these data and making radical changes potentially in how we provide care. And so that's very interesting to me, this macro view of data that would allow us to view patients not just as a one-time instance, but as a lifetime of history. And you combine that with related patients and their lifetime of history, you start to see the value, right, of the big data or the big analytics. And there's really no question that the opportunity is significant, but I do see that there are a number of barriers that we'll talk about in a little bit. Let's talk about what big data really means. I remember this from my Stats 101 class years ago in college. And it's the idea of the difference between a population and a sample. So historically, we've needed to use samples to complete research. In other words, a representative sample of a population. So everybody that had type 1 diabetes or type 2 diabetes, and it worked. But there was always the issue of sampling error or sampling bias, too small sample sizes. And that would be a very risky proposition when we look at researching new drugs or treatment modalities. Of course, there's statistical ways to control for some of those things. But the fact of the matter is, anytime you have to select a sample of a population to measure, you were, a little bit in a disadvantage. But that was just the reality of how these things worked. I think the interesting thing that big data provides us is this opportunity to truly look at the population of an entity, of any kind of thing, so type 1, type 2 diabetes. We could potentially be in a situation where as we start to share more and more healthcare data, as some of these groups come together and share their healthcare data, we will start to see the entire population of something and have the opportunity to measure them and look at what treatment modalities work best for them, looking at really rare comorbidities, that kind of a thing. And that's just not something that we've really had in the past. And that comes down to volume, right? It's just the fact of the matter is we're going from a situation where we had a subset or a very select amount of data available to us to now having so much data, this concept of big data, to be able to look at this amount of volume from a data perspective and go from looking at just a sample to now potentially looking at the population, looking at really rare instances of diseases or comorbidities or that kind of a thing. So you think about that not only from a certain conditions perspective, but the opportunity to compare other types of data like behavioral data with clinical data to show us the propensity of an individual has in developing a condition, or even tailoring the delivery of care to the individual based on certain preferences. The idea of big data has some really huge implications to healthcare. But as I said, there is a lot of barriers here. Regardless to how much data you have to ensure that there is the value in managing that data and storing this enormous amount of data. That's a whole other conversation about the cloud, but that aside, this data storm that's swirling around us, you really have to make sure that there's a lot of value in that and that the data is analyzed and used in a way that will benefit patients and the healthcare system positively, not just add more stuff for us to do. Last week, this big data thing is tweeting everywhere, and you do hashtag big data, you come up with hundreds and hundreds of references in the last 15 minutes, and Google it, and you just get an insane amount of information. And it occurred to me at one point, I saw a tweet come across and made some kind of comment about how this product was going to save your big data activity, and I just tweeted out a very simple statement. I just said, you just have to know that you're going to get, products and tools are only going to get you so far. You really need people and process more than tools and systems. And that can be a tough pill to swallow. But the fact of the matter is, that's true for lots of things, not just big data. That's true in a traditional BI sense too. A tool is just a tool. It's a hammer or a saw in your tool chest of things that we need to achieve. But at the end of the day, it's the people that use those tools that really provide the value to these activities. And big data, probably more than any other data, but certainly just as much, there's really only value in that big data if we're able to provide the context to that data, right? And the ability to manage it, and the ability to identify where that true value is from that data. And if you're just storing data for data's sake to say that you do big data, that's not really getting us anywhere. So what we need is this concept of data scientists, or people that are skilled in bringing these large quantities of data together and providing a lot of good context around them and that kind of a thing. So tools are important, and they really make some of the work much easier, but at the end of the day, you need the people that have the skill set that will provide you a lot of the context that brings the true value to big data.
Lauren?
So, yeah.
I have a question, and I think it's a really good one from the audience.
Okay.
Can you kind of talk about what the difference between business intelligence and big data is from that perspective? I know big data is the buzz term, and kind of the more on the real side versus going into data that you're storing. But from my point, I don't see a whole lot of difference between it, other than we have new buzzwords and maybe some new underlying technology. What do you think?
Sure. Yeah, that is a really good question, and I think it's pretty easy to get confused, in the context of business intelligence. So what I like to say about business intelligence is it really is an enablement mechanism. So it's not like you go to your business intelligence team to tell you what you should know about the industry or the company that you work in, right? That intelligence is embedded throughout the organization. Big data is just the fuel of the business intelligence program, right? It's just the amount of data that you store in your warehouse. And this idea that it's some new entity or something different is, I think, where we get a little bit lost in some of the marketing and sales stuff that we were all reading about. But really, the only difference is between now and this concept of big data and 5 years ago, or even longer than that ago. You can argue that we've always had the concept of big data, which is more data than we can really legitimately use. It's just that the volume and the velocity of the data has increased so rapidly within the last couple of years, particularly in healthcare from an EHR perspective, that's really where this has gained a lot of traction. So if you think about it this way, big data is just part of business intelligence, but it's the idea that the volume and the velocity of the data that we use in these BI systems has increased drastically. Does that help?
I think so. I think that's a good framing of that question that we had there. So thank you.
Sure. So with all of that said, what does big data really mean to you? At the end of the day, I had a boss a number of years ago that said to me that he made a very simple comment to me about analytics. He said the most important way that you can discern a report from an analytic deliverable is that it required somebody's gray matter. So that meant that you had to think about it. You had to stop and think about what you were doing and why you were doing it. And from an analytics perspective, it was each time you did something, right? Who's the audience that you're measuring? What is the difference between those pieces that you're measuring? And I think that's very true in this context as well. In order to solve the big problems that big data sort of brings to you, or the big headaches, if you will, somebody's got to stop and think about that. They have to think about the data that you're bringing in from these sources. They have to provide the context. They have to identify the value. It has to be measured. It has to be brought in and certified in your warehouse through a standard data governance procedure. That all requires somebody's work. So the potential for noisy data, or those common errors that exist in your data, to take over, really it means that you have a potential to get lost in the process improvements before you gain any real insight into your data. So know what you're measuring, invest in data that's valuable, and ignore the stuff that doesn't have tangible, very specific value tied to it, I think is the best way to approach this whole big data hullabaloo, if you will. So in a very awkward transition now, I'm going to move on to regulatory pressures. They may provide their own headache in and of themselves outside of the context of big data. But this is a schematic drawn from a picture that a client prospect showed me a number of years ago. And he sat me down and he slid this piece of paper over to me, and he said, I provide 1,400 reports to some regulatory body every quarter. And he said today, even though we have a data warehouse, it's not an enterprise data warehouse. So a lot of these reports require us to pull data from disparate sources. And I think that continues to be a reality of many organizations today, where they maybe don't pull in flat files of enrollment from another entity or whatever it is, right? There's flat files all over the place. A lot of us get flat files from CMS. So maybe you decided not to pull the flat files into your enterprise data warehouse. Maybe you didn't bring in a product database that some of your folks use. The number of instances of these scenarios really can grow exponentially with each conversation I have. But the idea here is that each of there's 14 blocks, and they each represent like 100 reports that we provide, so approximately 1,400. And on the left, of course, is our sources, and so maybe you do have a data warehouse, but you have a couple of flat files that you pull from to match. And so what you find yourself in is this situation where every time there's a new regulatory report that's required, or, which of course happens all the time, a change to these regulatory reports and the requirements associated with them, you sort of have to scramble to figure out how that impacts those source systems and how you pull that forward and that kind of a thing. So this is a really tough prospect, because what ends up happening from a business intelligence perspective is that you spend so much time managing that data, managing the sources that you pull that data from, managing the transformation that's required in order to use that data for these regulatory reports, that's really all you end up doing. So your BI program, from a value perspective, provides regulatory reports, and that's an important checkbox activity that we all have to do. But as far as streamlining, there's no streamlining, and every quarter it comes to your quarterly reporting cycle, and you spend a whole lot of time checking that box. And I think one of the important things for us to recognize is that a true enterprise data warehouse, where we pull in all of our disparate sources and transform that data, will streamline those needs a lot faster, with a lot more repeatable processes, and with better results over time. So this easy visual comparison is really meant to prompt a very specific response in you. It's like you look at the one I just showed, right, with all these lines everywhere and this mess, and it sort of is overwhelming. And then you look at this and you're like, oh yes, that's much better. That's much better. So, I don't need to tell any of you on the phone. I'm sure you're dealing with this and living with this now, whether you have a true enterprise data warehouse where you integrate all your disparate source systems, or you're dealing with the previous slide. This is tough work to achieve. But what I talk about in the book and what I talk about in my day-to-day practice is this idea that if we don't continually deliver value to our business users, the people that support our program, we will set ourselves up to fail. And if you spend an entire quarter trying to figure out how to check that box of regulatory reporting, you really don't have a lot of time to get past all of that and provide really important pieces of valuable information that's embedded in that data. And that's where these processes associated with data warehousing can come in very handy. I'm not saying that there's not a lot of work associated with this picture. Drawing a picture for a PowerPoint is a very, very simple thing compared to the actual work that's required to make your healthcare information environment look like this. But the value that you receive on the other end of getting this work done is really, you really can't put a number on that. Well, you could actually, but that's another webinar about the return on investment for enterprise data warehouses. So in another awkward transition, we're going to talk about the next agenda item, which is the top 10 things that we'd like you to sidestep, the things that we'd like you to avoid as you're attempting to continue to manage your healthcare business and intelligence program, or if you're starting up, or if you're restarting, if you've done this before and things just kind of got out of hand and now you're trying to pull things and get your legs under you again. Here are some things that I see all the time. And it's just crazy to me that we're still seeing these things. So please don't do these things. So number 10, in the true style of David Letterman, Please don't make a consultant the leader of your program. Talked to a healthcare company that called me up and said, we've been doing this for a year and a half and we still haven't gotten any real value out of it, and we're not really sure what happened. And then I asked them who was leading their program, and they said, this person from this consulting company. And not that consultants aren't smart. Of course we're smart, right? I'm a consultant. I'm a trustworthy person. I'm relatively smart. But the thing is that my needs are not aligned with your needs of your organization. My needs are aligned with the needs of my organization. And oddly enough, I will find a way to make sure that you will always need me because that's the need of my organization. And this is a real slippery slope, right? I think that you can have somebody that is really trustworthy and you respect them a great deal and they're smart and they know a lot about the industry and they're doing a pretty good job. But they're still aligned to ensure that they stay there for a long time because that's what most consulting companies want. I think the best way to use consultants in this context is to bring them in when they can bulk up either a big development effort that's going to be for a short amount of time, or they bring a specific skill set that you don't have on your team yet. But this is one thing that I don't ever want to see. Make an employee the leader of your healthcare BI program. I think it's very important. So number 9, I should have written 2 things here. I should have said don't underestimate the importance of ETL and data modeling. In the book, I go into that a great deal. I write about the tenets of healthcare business intelligence. One of them is technology and architecture. We really oftentimes will downplay the importance of both ETL and data modeling, not wanting to take the time really to do either one of them. Of course, we all know if we're in BI that ETL is generally 80% of the activity. But I think the challenge with that idea is it's 80% of the activity, so I'm just going to skip it, and there's this sort of this suck and plunk concept, right? You suck it out of the source system, you plunk it into your warehouse, and you hope for the best. Nothing can degrade the adoption of a BI program faster than inaccurate or inconsistent data, which will happen in all likelihood if you just do the suck and plunk. It's very important for us to focus on the less glamorous parts of data warehousing, assuming that there are any glamorous parts of data warehousing. But we really need to focus on some of the below the waterline work, as it were, of the ETL, so really solid methods associated with ETL, following some best practices, and data modeling. So when we think about data modeling, it's just how we structure our data and how it relates to one another. And that's important for lots of reasons. Obviously, performance is usually the one that we talk about most. But the other one that we don't think about too much is that it also impacts the quality of the data. And I tell sort of a terrifying true story about what can happen if you don't model your data appropriately. So please don't underestimate the value of those 2 things, ETL and data modeling. Also very important, obviously, is don't ignore the value of data governance. We tend to sort of shy away a lot of times from anything that's referred to as governance because it feels big and bureaucratic, and most people don't feel like they need to have yet another big bureaucratic activity associated with anything in their organization. And certainly I've seen big bureaucratic data governance functions. I think the most important thing about data governance is there has to be a shared definition of your data, and you have to acknowledge that your data requires management. And if you do those 2 things, and then as a part of the data governance function, focus a lot on data quality of your data, those are the things that are really important in the genesis of good data governance programs. I don't believe in big bureaucratic data governance programs. As a matter of fact, I think the smaller, more agile, dynamic data governance programs function the best because they can turn things around, and they have a speed to value that really allows your warehousing program to move quickly and from an agile perspective through projects, and that means delivering value to your end users. So number 7, don't forget to manage the project. And we all do this once in a while, right? We sort of get down and gathered all our requirements and things are moving along, and we're really focused and we're heads down, and one person thought they were managing the project and the other person thought the other person is managing the project, and then it turns out that nobody's really managing the project. It's very, I'm using the word important too much, but it's critical for us to recognize that these projects don't manage themselves. There's a lot of moving parts. There's usually a lot of different functions or different sets of expertise that are required in order to get data from a disparate source system into an enterprise data warehouse, through data governance procedures, into a BI presentation layer. So a project manager that has some experience in business intelligence has a lot of value to that activity, and particularly if you have a program where you're managing lots of different projects. I've seen this happen a lot where we just fail to appropriately manage the project. That's not a good feeling, and we should try to avoid that. Number 6 is the failure to incorporate business users. And this, it's strange to me that as a business intelligence program we don't reach out to the business, but this happens a lot. I think one of the most important things that we have to recognize is that, again, business intelligence isn't a team that knows everything about your company. It's an enablement mechanism. And in order to do that well, reaching out to the business users is critical. You have to have a really strong and solid relationship out to each of those departments, and you have to understand and know their requirements and their preferences. And that allows you to have a relationship as such that allows you to continue to provide value out to those departments. And a lot of times what I see data warehousing projects that have delivered a lot of depth to one department but have completely ignored all the other ones. And you'll see it mainly because there's good relationships there, or the data is a little bit easier to grab, or what have you. And that's a great spot to start. I wouldn't argue that that's a good spot to start. But then you have to expand that out, and you have to start reaching out to those other business users throughout the company in order to provide true enterprise value to the organization. So continue to reach out to those other business users. Don't overlook change management. And this is one of the tenets that I wrote about in the book, is this cultural implications of business intelligence programs in healthcare. It is amazing to me how much business intelligence can change an organization if it has that opportunity to do that. The whole focus of business intelligence as this enablement mechanism is to allow your organization from going from decision making by gut to decision making by data. And that's a big shift for a lot of organizations. And that has a lot of change management implications throughout your company. And oftentimes we just look at this as another project, right? And sometimes it's a strategic level project at the executive level. But a lot of times we just look at these things as a project that's got a task list, and once we're done with the task list, we're good to go. We release it out into the ether, and then nothing seems to happen. We don't have any adoption. Nobody seems to be rallying around it. We felt like we were meeting the business requirements of the end users, and still nothing happens. That has a lot to do with change management and this ecosystem of your organization and how you release this entity out into that environment. So we all have to recognize that this build it and they will come concept really does not happen like that. It's very much about the organization as a whole, this ecosystem, and the change management concepts that follow that. Don't disregard release cycles. So this idea of releasing content out into the world. And this is a little bit related to change management and the idea that as you're building out a data warehousing program, I prefer agile methods, but even if you follow waterfall methods, this idea of knowing when to release content and how to release content and being very methodical about that is important. You have to wrap that around a bunch of communication about what's coming. You have to wrap it around training for not only the use of the data but the use of the system. So often I see this scenario where we're finished with the project and then it just sort of goes away and we don't talk about that next step of deployment. And that's an easy fix for us, right? It's just an additional set of tasks in your project list where you start to communicate about what is coming and what it's going to do for the organization, and you talk a little bit about training and how we're going to train the end users in order to take advantage of that content that you're releasing. So this concept is just release cycles, and it's part of the project management activity. So number 3 is don't neglect your staff. And this is sort of related to number 10, and don't make a consultant the lead of your program. A lot of times as we're building up these data warehouses, it's going to be a big influx of activity. We bring a whole bunch of consultants in to help support us. And this is interesting to me. I did this as a director of BI, and saw the error of my ways. But I'd bring consultants in, and I'd have the consultants build all the new stuff, and I'd have all my staff support the old stuff. And I did that because the staff knew the old stuff, right? That's where they built that. They had a lot of comfort level with it. But then the consultants left, and none of my staff knew what the consultants had built. And in some form, that's neglect, right? I mean, all of your staff wants to be building the new thing. So bring consultants in and let them take care of the old stuff. Let them do the care and feeding of your environment and do those quarterly reports. You can train them on how to do that. It's not impossible. Take a little time, but the value that you get out of allowing your staff to build some of that new stuff, I think, is really, really critical. Not only will they feel a lot of ownership in it, but your staff has the most depth in your organization, in your industry, to be able to provide a lot of context that consultants won't be able to do. Even an industry-specific consultant like myself. So I think that's very important to think about your staff in that different way as you deploy these really large data warehousing projects. Number 2, don't ignore maintenance. You're releasing a lot of content out into the system. You have BI products on the front end. You probably have ETL products in the back end. You have your database systems. All that requires people in order to keep the maintenance up. And a lot of times what happens is you release this thing, your project is done, you got all the task lists done, and you don't really think about what it means to maintain these environments over time. And you think about this idea of data being like a river, and that river is going to go to the lowest lying area, right? It's just, it will make a mess out of itself if you leave it alone. So, one of the things I see with some frequency is I get a phone call like, we did this great thing 3 years ago. We brought this consultant in. They helped us build it all out. It was working beautifully, and now we don't know what happened. And then I ask them where their team is, and they say, what team? The consultants left 3 years ago. What are you talking about? So these systems require maintenance and care and feeding. It's not as big as the effort it takes to build them, but it still takes effort, and we shouldn't forget that. And then finally, you've heard me say it probably 4,000 times already in the last 40 minutes. It's all about the value. You can be forgiven for a lot if you continue to provide value out to your business users as you sort of get your own data warehousing BI house in order. So if you just keep a laser-like focus on providing value in the context of information, of highly useful data in that way to your end users, you're going to be able to deliver a lot more from a data warehousing environment. So a couple of future trends for you. As I was writing the book, it's probably about 18 months ago now, 20 months ago, I had gone to the doctor for my annual physical, and I actually received this lab report in the mail. You can't really see it now after a number of scanned copies. But this is actually the piece of paper that I got in the mail, and a corresponding letter that came with it that said, all your results are normal. And that made me feel really good for about 30 seconds, because being normal is a lovely thing. But then I kept looking at this report. I literally had this sitting on my desk at home as I was writing my book, and I kept looking over at it and looking over at it. Something was really bothering me about this. And I realized what was bothering me about this. I live in the world of data, and I live in the world of healthcare data. And I'm receiving this information, these data points, as a very informed consumer, not only about data, but about my health. And as you can see here, there's sort of on the left-hand side is the test that they ran in my blood test. And the middle column there is what's clearly a table column name of latest _ref _RNG, reference range, and then the date in which that happened. So, and then there's, of course, my value on the right-hand column there. And it just really bothered me. And then I realized that there was absolutely no reason why we were presenting the data like this. There's just no reason for it. What if you get this and you have no context of what latest _ref_orange is? I just happen to know it because I've seen it before. So I believe that healthcare BI has to go to the patient. And I think this is going to happen really rapidly because the patients that we're treating now, the next generation, has this bigger demand for information than we've ever really seen before. And this is just a simple bullet graph of the same data we just saw on that previous lab screen, right? But this gives us so much more context. This gives us the actual value in that bold black line, and it gives you the yellow, green, red context of if you're in the red, you're doing poorly, and you better check it out, right? I don't need a degree in data analysis to understand what latest ref_orange is. I don't need a clinical degree to understand that I probably need to ask my doctor, about my rheumatoid factor. This is fake data, by the way. This is just mocked up. The lab was real. So this is really what we need to do. This is where we need to close the gap, is providing better visualized data out to our end users, particularly as we start this sort of brave new world of the healthcare information exchange and buying your own healthcare and better transparency, cost. We better have better transparency of the clinical data that we're providing to these organizations or to these people, these individuals, and I believe that will happen sooner rather than later. The other part is privacy, and I think privacy expectations on privacy are changing really quickly. I sort of make a joke here about your Facebook posts and Twitter, but many people share a lot of health information more readily on social media sites than they do with their own physician. And some of these social media sites have a lot of value in them from that perspective. So, this does relate, of course, closely with BI to the patient, but the idea that the patients that we're treating now, this younger generation and the generation coming up behind them, they have different expectations for the need of privacy and confidentiality associated with their data. And therefore, I think that the demand on us from a privacy and confidentiality perspective will change drastically in the next 5 to 10 years.
Well, thank you, Laura, for sharing your time and insights with us today. And I know we all sincerely appreciate it.
Thank you.
So moving on to question and answers, we'd like to take questions from the audience. And please use the chat tool to the left of the screen to do that. As well, on the current slide, we do have Laura's contact details for those who might have specific challenges which they would like to follow up directly with Laura. I know it's been requested a couple times, but so here it is. And again, her new book is available on Amazon.com for those who must have the complete business intelligence blueprint. So one of the questions we have that I can handle really quickly, yes, we'll have the PowerPoint available as well as a recording, so you can not only look at it yourself and revisit it, but also potentially forward it to friends. So one of the questions we had, Laura, was how do you build the BI team? You have, you need a leader. Who should be that leader? I believe, and you have the business users, IT, and some of the other professionals. How does that work?
That's a great question. Particularly with my focus on making sure that your staff really has what they need in order to be successful. I think there are some standard roles that you need for a BI program. Obviously, you need somebody that's going to be able to architect your data. You need some folks that do the ETL, some folks that do the report development. But really, from a BI perspective, I think there's some pretty strong rules of thumb that I like to follow. Number one is your BI team, your business intelligence team, should reside in the business and be aligned strongly with the business and those end users. Then there are some very traditional things that are IT focused and always have been, right? ETL is a very IT-like function that should be in IT. Data architecture is very much an IT function, although they should have a dotted line to business. because it's important for them to understand that context of business. So there's some strong lines that you can draw between the BI team and the data warehousing team, but a lot of relationships need to occur between those two teams, the BI team and the data warehousing team. So as far as who should be the leader, I talk a fair amount about leadership and sponsorship in the book, and I have a great case study, an example of a gentleman who is just an incredible leader of a BI program at Blue Cross Blue Shield of Kansas City. I think the most important thing from a BI leader for healthcare organizations is this idea of being very visionary about what it can provide to the healthcare organization. I can promise you that the only thing that is consistent about these projects that we undertake is that there's going to be challenges. And if you have somebody at the helm that has a laser-like focus on the value that BI and data warehousing can provide to your organization, those challenges that come along the way are just going to be hiccups. The alternative to that is just having somebody that knows how to manage data, and those challenges can really put you off the tracks. So I'd really encourage that you have a strong visionary leader leading the helm from a BI perspective for your organization, and then sort of draw those lines between the business and IT, as I mentioned earlier.
Okay. Another one we have, which I think is, since a lot of this is happening, bring your own device to work, as well as the huge growth in mobile, is how does the mobile technologies affect going forward healthcare?
Yeah, that's interesting. I in the book, in the future trends section, I talk a little bit more about mobile than I did today. Mobile is definitely here to stay. Obviously, we're all obsessed with our devices. I think the interesting way that mobility impacts healthcare really hasn't been seen yet in a tangible way. But the value of mobility is really about the change in a specific behavior. So in other words, if I am a chief nursing officer, and one of my focuses on the quality of care, and I'm really worried about, in particular, this idea of people washing their hands in and out of a room, or at least hitting the dispensers of the antibacterial foam as they enter and exit a room. The technology allows us now to use our RFIDs on the tags of our staff and on the device itself, the foam device that are on the wall, to actually identify enough geography, the closeness of the individual to that device. And you can have maps of your entire hospital, and it can give you red spots to where people maybe aren't foaming in and out. And that's where mobility really has an opportunity to change behavior. It's about the intervention in healthcare, right? It's this idea that you could go to a floor and you find out that it's a simple issue of where that foam thing is installed. If you open the door, the foam dispenser is behind it, instead of directly to the left, where somebody can see it as they come in and exit the room. So it has the ability, mobility has the ability to change the behavior at the point of intervention, which, as we all know, is the way to go. And that's really the close time to value is really about the data frequency and that ability to change behavior. It's really not a BI answer, but I think it is how mobility will change healthcare.
I was at a McKinsey special panel about a month ago. There was a number of doctors, as well as guys from Genentech and so forth. And one of the things that several of the doctors were using, which I think will add even more data to the system, both from a big data and a business intelligence, is a lot of these secondary devices where one was recording one doctor's sleep, one was recording his temperature and blood pressure, and actively all day long, and basically providing all that telemetry into his smartphone so they could upload it.
Yep.
It's really a kind of a sea change in how to proactively manage one's health in this space.
Absolutely. The quantified self movement, which I am myself taking advantage of, is pretty fascinating.
Okay, and then we'll go to the last question here before we go into some of the wrap-up, I have one question around providing value. How do you start providing value early in the project and then continue? What does it look like? Continue providing value, I believe, is the question. Throughout that project and past the project.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting because I think the person that asked the question is articulating a specific challenge we have, and that's the difference between providing value when you start and providing value as you continue on with these programs. Providing value as you start these programs is actually a little bit easier because generally speaking, you have a lot more low-hanging fruit. Based on all of the pain points of the people that you've talked to, that there are just some reports or some ad hoc analysis that you can provide in the next 3 weeks that's going to blow somebody's socks off because you already have the data there. You just didn't know that there was a need. Nobody had articulated a need yet. The ability to provide value as you start is a lot easier. The need to continue to provide value gets harder and harder as we go along because we are going to pick things that are easier for us to do, and the more mature we get in our data warehousing activity, the further along on the difficulty scale we get, right? So it's going to take us longer and longer and longer to provide some of those valuable pieces. So I think the person that asked the question has probably been through this and is living the pain of that value chain piece. So I always encourage organizations to always have a queue of backed up work. And that should be a queue of things like reports, ad hoc analysis, alerts, dashboards, whatever it is, right? And you have a method of sort of objectively quantifying those so that you know where they fall in the priority. And even if it's just for one thing, that's a great communication tool so that everybody knows where each of their requests are at any given time. It's also a great prioritization tool because you quickly learn what you can achieve in a really short amount of time, i.e. that low-hanging fruit, and what set of things is going to be really hard. Now there's nothing magic about this. It's just really good project management. What you want to do is those things that are going to be really difficult for us to deliver are going to take longer. And so what we do is we mix the projects so that we have a series of low-hanging fruit pieces where you're delivering value out to people as consistently as you can, while sort of behind the scenes you're working on some of those more difficult items, pulling that data in, integrating it, all of those kinds of things, so that from an end user perspective you're still providing value all along the way, and then you finally get to that one big piece that has been tougher for you to deliver over time. The other way to think about it is that sometimes you can take something that already exists and just turn it on its side, and that will provide a lot of value to a different group of users. We all use these data. It's the same data, but oftentimes we think about it in a different way. So we have in a payer organization, you have your product team, which thinks about the data in a very different way than your sales team does, or your operations team where they're answering phone calls from your members, right? So it's the same data. We're all talking about members and utilization and the cost associated with it. But if you turn it slightly and look at it from a product perspective, we're talking about utilization, in the context of product margin and benefit structures. But utilization from a call center is the same data, but a call center is wondering when is the last time somebody went to a physician, or what physician, or when they went to the most, a specific pharmacy, that kind of thing. So thinking about it in those terms, that's two sort of ways to think about it, right? Is get that project going that's going to take you a long time while delivering value from some of those low-hanging fruit items. But this other part is looking at it and trying to turn that data on its side and providing value to maybe a different entity using the same data in your organization.
Yeah, that's really good. I think that you're doubling your effort or magnifying using a force multiplier there.
Absolutely.
When you take that consideration on it.
Yep.
So we really appreciate your time today and your insight, Laura.
Thank you.
On the blog there, her blog, evidently there's a copy and paste error that we'll fix before we get the presentation posted. But the blog is http://blog.lancetsoftware.com. So apologize for that copy paste issue. So we produce these webinars every month. The Big Data Thought Leadership webinars is a series. It's a monthly production of Cetas offering expert insights into emerging topics in big data and big data analytics. No product marketing from our side. We just want to deliver valuable information to our constituents that are interested. And your feedback is always appreciated on these, as well as if you have any topics you would like to hear about or specific speakers that you'd like to hear from. So our March Big Data Thought Leader is Wayne Erickson. He's the author of numerous books on big data and business intelligence dashboards. His latest work is Secrets of Analytical Leaders, Insights from Informational Insiders. This crosses numerous industry verticals. And Wayne interviews the best and brightest in big data and shares his insights with us. So you can see here, just a few. He's interviewed big data guys at Netflix, Facebook. It's a really great book if you haven't read it. You can register today for this webinar or future webinars at www.cetas.net/webinars. And we do have a free analytics tool that if you have that need, you can leverage that. And again, you can go and find both our future webinars and our past webinars on our website. So we really appreciate you joining us today, and thank you for your time.